Are you around? I see Jorge. Continue with this second session of this seminar, international seminar, the China Effect, Rethinking Development in Latin America and the Caribbean. Fortunately, the colleagues that will present do not require any long introductions. I think it's better to listen to them. So we will have the presentations of Rhys Jenkins from the University of East Anglia, and then followed by Jorge Carrillo Viveros from El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, and Evan Ellins from Latin American Studies of the U.S. War College Strategic Studies University, all members also of the Red ILSA China. And I think we can follow and base our presentations also on the first session, no? And hope, and I'm looking forward to have a good continuing discussion, no? I remember everybody that the questions we are inviting everybody to allow to put your questions in the chat. And so we will have at least one round, probably even two rounds of responses by Rhys, Jorge, and Evan. And well, thank you very much for keeping your presentations of 20, maximum 25 minutes. Rhys, the floor is yours, please.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Enrique. Right. I will try to get my presentation up.
Yes, you should be able to share the screen.
If I can find the presentation, which seems to have disappeared.
Okay.
I don't know what. Yes, I'm sorry about this, everybody.
No?
No.
Otherwise, as we say, there is life without PowerPoint.
What I don't understand is how I was able to share it before the
No? Or if you want to, you can send us the presentation.
well, I've managed to find it now.
Just open your PowerPoint and look in the recent presentations.
Yes. No, I found the presentation. Can you hear me still?
We can hear you, yes.
Right. But you can't see the presentation.
No presentation at this point, no.
If you want to, I can speak first and then Rhys.
Okay, or we do that, exactly. Is that okay, Rhys? Then we start with Jorge.
Yes, okay,
So
fine.
we do not lose too much time. Yes?
Yeah.
Thank
Yes.
you very much, Jorge. So we start with you.
And access
Thank you.
to the, can I have access to for make my presentation? Okay.
Yes, there you go. Yeah. Yes, we can see it very well. Thank you, Jorge.
Good morning. So you see, right, my presentation?
Perfectly.
No, but there is a problem with. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the transition in technological terms and the tension between U.S. and China and what is reflecting this issue for Mexico. And before I start, well, thank you to Firat and Enrique for this invitation. And I will also to make some announcement. Last June, your PISA a network uh, specialized on the automotive industry has the colloquium, and I recommend to visit the website of Herpisa because it was in China, in Shanghai. So a lot of information, a lot of papers, a lot. So I really will uh, recommend that. We visit in June some companies in Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen, and what surprised me was not the volume, efficiency, automation in these companies, but the huge enthusiasm. The huge enthusiasm and all stakeholders are aligned in the fast-moving and highly innovative ecosystem. That's really surprised me. Well, let me start. There are some changes in terms of production and geography. In 2000, in 2000, US was the first global producer, and nowadays is China, uh, and Mexico also improve. But well, there is the start the competition between US and China. Another important aspect is the electrification of the automotive industry. In 2015, it was just 1% of the represents the EV cars, including the uh, plug-in and hybrid, and in 2024 is almost third, one third of the participation, 32%. So and it's well, you see the data of electrical and plug-in and hybrid. Of course, China is one of the most important producer, and the second one is Europe, not US, is Europe in this regard. So this is one uh, main importance of the one main important change. The second one is the who has the leadership in this process. Of course, firms like BYD and others, but it's so clear in this case that three times higher the volume producers of vehicles in China regarding with US, and in terms of the EV stock, oh, it's many times more. So it's so clear who is taking the leadership in this regard. Third, and very important because hasn't there hasn't been so many information regarding exports, and the export shows that China is the first exporter of the automotive nowadays, and US is in the ninth place. Uh, and regarding with these exports, well, you have some information about where does the export goes to, and Latin America is increasing. It's important, of course. Asia and Europe is the most important places. But anyway, the exports is a reality in terms of this taking the leadership, also not just for the domestic market, but also in terms of the global exports. Talking about
Jorge, maybe you can enlarge your exactly. Yes. Thank you very much. Gracias.
okay, the problem is I cannot. Let me see if I can change. So this is an interesting information, as I mentioned to you, and this is the export changes. And one other very interesting thing is in a few years, all these transitions in the automotive industry from China is shaking the world, right? So how about the governance in terms of changes? Let me put this more, okay. So in 2000, the global production mostly comes from the incumbents, I mean the traditional OEMs. By the way, a few of them, and the emerging firms was not so important, only 3% in 2000. By 2024, the emerging increased a lot, and firms such as BYD, Chery, Li Auto, and many others are now in the scenario. And an interesting thing in this table, if we compare Chinese and US, well, first of all, has more or less the double in terms of production of combustion. I mean, the gasoline cars, the hybrid, the plug-in, and the electrical, Chinese versus US. When we're talking about just the electrical, I mean, plug-in and full electric, is 65% versus 9% in terms of the global market sales. If we are talking about in terms of the EV emerging companies, who are the leading in these emerging companies? Well, it's almost 80% Chinese versus 9% US. In terms of the EV battery demand, the same. It's 60% versus 13. In terms of robots, the global market size, the same. Is I said we're talking about 50 or to 60% more or less. And the exports, as I mentioned, is 35% comes from the exports to the world of the automotive. I mean, passengers is 35%, while US is only 7. And also in terms of the labor productivity, we try to, in a very simple way, to measure between 2010 2024 in terms of people employed and units in terms of output. And the only country has a positive labor productivity was China, and US is a minus 0.5%. So this in a very synthetic way means who's the winner in this transition process. Of course, one of the main discussion is if it's the innovation, the core of this, in order to explain this transition. And of course, innovation is important, but I think innovation is all around in all the countries, especially the US and China, but in all the countries. But what is really maybe most important in terms of the specificity is the vertical integration model. Remember that US, I mean, early 100 years ago was vertical integration model, and then starting making the spin-offs of the suppliers, and then comes the lean production model with all the tier system, and again is taking advantage the vertical integration. And this is just one image, but it explains everything that BYD has their own chips in order to move their cars, right? So besides all of this, there is also a very important issue that very few people are talking about is the technological alliance. We haven't studied this for a while, and we found there are many alliance in all OEMs, in most of the suppliers, the global suppliers, and of course in the emerging companies between automotive industry, auto part industry, and the technological companies. But this is including more and more another sector, such as banks, retailers, oh, you name it. So it's in this transition to more digitalized, sustainable, and in this twin transition is so important the competition. What means is companies, as Enrique mentioned, all companies are competing inside China and outside China, but also they are cooperating, and that's important. It's not is the case of Tesla, is the case of BYD, Huawei, oh, you name it. We try to measure that, and by the way, it's just a commercial. In 2 more weeks, I'm going to publish a book on this technological alliance. If anybody is interested in the book, the ebook, I will gladly send you by just send me an email, please. So there are another study because there are very few studies on that by our colleague Pizzo is he's part of the JRPs as well, and he shows clearly as well two important things. One is the vertical, the role of vertical in the alliance, and also there are the most of them. I mean, I don't know. I haven't seen the percentage, but usually it's like 60% or more is between China companies. So that means that it's not just a vertical integration among each firm, but also they are cooperating between the China firms. So that's give a more pressure to this dynamic sector. So this show this information. So how about the Mexican automotive industry? Well, as maybe the people that are here in this seminar knows that Mexico has been pointed as one of the tension for attention between U.S. and China because the exports and the investment in Mexico, the Chinese investment, so the threat for U.S. So we try to understand that the scores coming from the U.S. government, and first of all, Mexico has a very specific model. Maybe you know that is very clear in this graphic. Most of we're talking about almost 4 million cars in 2024, and most of them are for exports. The gray bars are the domestic product for domestic production, but interesting, the blue line. The blue line is the imports. So we export cars with more price, and we import cheapest car. So that more or less is that's the model in Mexico. And the investment has been growing, of course, with the pandemic decline a lot, but still it's still important, and we don't know the forecast because many uncertainties so far. So in terms of electrification, this is interesting because Chinese brands in terms of production is, I mean, not even 1% in 2024 of the total production. In terms of sales, 8%. So it's very small. Of course, it's growing so fast. I mean, it depends what you want to say. Of course, I can show you the BYD share of the market, and it looks like, oh, it's growing so fast. But in the big picture is for 2025, it's only 9% of the total cars selling in Mexico are EVs, but most of them are hybrid, not even full or plug-in, but 70% is hybrid. So that means it's very marginal, the participation of electrification in Mexico. And the data is, I mean, it's a fact. So the conclusions is, I mean, in a simple ways, Mexico is increasing the taxes for the Chinese EVs in Mexico. Is some kind of pressures for discourage Chinese FDI, not just in the case of BYD, but there are many other experience. I mean, historically experience from the commercial in the close to the Cancun area, to the trains, to the lithium, and nowadays with BYD and other companies. And of course, there is a constant uncertainty in this process. So, I mean, it's clear that we have a structural dependence on the American economy, and is increasing this dependence, and also there is a searching for a North American EV pact ongoing. So my opinion, of course, is always personal, is the urgent necessary smart diversification, because we have a lot of challenge, and we have a lot of problems based on the model that we have been developing for a while, not just the maquila, but the FDI model in Mexico. So we need to smart diversification, and China is a key country in that way, in that sense. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Jorge. Very interesting, highly related to the presentation of Celio Iratuca, but also of Rebecca Ray. We will continue. Riz, are you able to find your PPT?
I think so. Yes, fingers crossed.
Okay, we looking forward.
Can
And
you see it?
No, I don't see.
I haven't got it sharing. Maybe that's what I've got to do now. Right.
Okay. Yes, there we go, Riz. Thank you very much.
Yes. Sorry about the hiccups getting it up. The technology
No
is
worries. Thank you.
quite advanced for me. Okay. So I was thinking about what I should talk about today, and I thought, well, let's go for something fairly specific. And I set myself this question about whether, it's just not my question, but it's a question that's been addressed these days, whether the US is pushing Latin America into the arms of China. And the way that I wanted to address that question was really, to look at it in terms of debate, what the effects of the China-US trade war, and more recently the turn towards protectionism under the second Trump presidency in the United States, how that was going to affect the relationships between Latin America and China on the one hand, and Latin America and the US on the other. And, I think looking at commentaries and literature on this, you can see three kinds of perspectives. That one that says that it's going to lead to closer links between China and Latin America and reduce the influence of the United States in the region, or alternatively, that the US is actually strengthening its links with Latin America in order to counter Chinese influence. And thirdly, taking up the point that's been made in the earlier panel, there's a view that there's considerable differential effects within the region that reflects the heterogeneity of Latin America and their relations with both the United States and with China. Now I'm going to focus particularly on the economic dimensions in my presentation, and I should do what the
we can see it very well. Oops.
Oh, right.
Yes, there we go.
I thought I'd make it even better by putting it onto full screen and do it on slide sharing. So the question really, to put it in some kind of context, I thought it was useful to talk about the idea of displacement. And there's a recent book that I'm sure a number of you will know by Francisco Diñez from the Universidad Católica in Santiago, Chile, on economic displacement. And he talks more broadly about the way in which China is displacing the United States in the region, taking into account trade, foreign investment, loans, and aid. I'm just focusing in my presentation on trade because I think that's the more important aspect of the economic relations between China and Latin America. As we've seen, for example, in Celio's presentation on Brazil, that the share of China in trade is much more significant than its share in foreign investment. And I thought just to put this in some kind of longer-term context, I'd look at the shares of China and the United States in both exports and imports since China joined the WTO in, some of these say 2021. It's actually, it's from 2001 rather than from 2021. And what you can see in the first panel is for Latin America as a whole. You saw particularly in the first decade of the 20th century, steady rise in China and share of both export and imports, and a decline in the US share of both. China's increasing share tends to continue throughout the period, and the decline in the US shares kind of leveled off in the second decade of the 21st century. The other three panels show the differences between South America, in the top right panel, where clearly China has overtaken the United States, both in terms of its share of the region's imports and the share of exports. And the situation in the bottom two panels that reflect Mexico and Central America and the Dominican Republic, in both of which cases that despite an increased share of China, particularly in imports to those areas, the United States continues to have a much more significant share. And the share of exports from both Mexico and Central America going to China, the bottom lines in those graphs are very low. Okay, so that's again in terms of background. Now, looking particularly at the more recent developments and what happened, I don't think I need to spend time on this. Probably quite familiar with the kind of policies that have been pursued in relation to China and more generally trade policies by the US government under Donald Trump, starting with the, in his first administration, with the imposition of tariffs on China, which during his time in the first Trump government increased so that by the end of the period, about 2/3 of imports from by the United States from China were subject to tariffs in the United States, and China retaliated. And again, about 60% of imports from the US to China were covered. Now, the point I want to make here is that Latin America was not directly affected by US trade restrictions in that period. It was directed particularly at China and particularly around particular products, and the Latin American major exporters in steel and aluminium were given exemptions. And that's quite different from the situation in the current Trump administration. The US tariffs on imports from China were hiked up to much higher levels, and they covered all US imports. China retaliated again by putting on tariffs on all of US imports from the US. But the United States also adopted these so-called reciprocal tariffs, which applied to all countries at different rates, and that directly affected Latin America, which hadn't been the case in the first Trump government. And although recently there have been some exemptions announced, 200 food products imported into the United States, some of which are of interest to Latin America, like bananas, coffee, and so on, were exempt. And they've also reached framework agreements with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Argentina, which give those countries certain advantages. Now, how can we look at the likely effects of these protectionist policies and trade war on Latin America, US, and Latin America-China relations? And I've going to do that by approaching it from the perspective of 4 potential effects that protectionist policies have, that I've set out here. Trade destruction, which occurs when domestic production replaces imports and reduces trade. Trade diversion, where importers switch their suppliers to countries which aren't subject to trade barriers in the importing country. Trade deflection, which is when exporters switch sales to countries where they don't face such high trade barriers. And the rerouting, where exports are diverted through third countries, which are subject to lower trade barriers, for re-export to the country that's imposed protection. So what I want to try and do in my presentation is to look at what evidence there is that each of these has affected trade between Latin America and the US and China, and also how it has differed in different countries in the region. Now, one of the problems, of course, with this kind of analysis is that it's difficult to see the effects, because it's very early to see the effects of Trump's second administration. And it's also been difficult to track exactly what's happening, because it keeps changing. There's been a high degree of instability in terms of exemptions, increases, reductions, changes, continuous announcements about what US trade policy actually is. So, I mean, faced with that, I thought, well, one can look at it from 3 points of view. And there are sort of what one might expect from economic theory to happen, One can look back at the experience of what happened during the first Trump administration, how that affected relations with Latin America. And one can look at some of the evidence, what little evidence there is, and some from simulations of the impacts of the changes that have taken place, that have been done, and try to use those to predict what the impacts could be. Okay, let me start with trade destruction. I mean, theoretically, of course, trade destruction depends on the level of protection that a country that's imposed. And the higher the level of protection, the more likely it is that local production will replace imports. And also linked to that, and I think important in the current context, is the uncertainty about future policies. So expectations as well as the actual levels is affected by uncertainty. And of course, whether there is trade destruction or not actually depends on the substitutability of domestic production for imports. How far can local production replace imported goods? Now, during the first Trump administration, there was obviously trade destruction between China and the US. There's a fall in US imports from China, and these weren't replaced by imports from the rest of the world. China's retaliation led to fall in imports from the US, but imports from the rest of the world increased. So there didn't seem to be so much trade destruction on the Chinese side. But of course, because Latin America was only subject to tariffs on specific products and received exemptions for important ones, the amount of trade destruction as far as the Latin America trade with the US was concerned was not very significant. Now, that's changed, of course, with the current Trump administration, because protection applies to Latin America as well. The UN has predicted across the board that there'll be total trade destruction as a result of US tariffs of about 450 billion US dollars. That's not just Latin America, that's global. Now, just to give you an idea of how countries might be affected, I've taken the estimates from the Centro for Global Development of the average tariffs, that is taking account of specific product rates and exemptions. So really, these are effective tariffs on goods imported from Latin America. And what you can see there is that Brazil faces the highest average, over 25%, because, of course, Trump imposed the 50% tariff on Brazil. Nicaragua of the Latin American countries comes next, and you go all the way down to some of the oil exporters, who, because oil is exempt, Venezuela and Guyana and Mexico, because of the USMCA, face the lowest effective tariffs. And where people have done simulations of the impacts, and they also show that the largest countries with the largest tariffs are the ones that are going to be most affected, have the biggest drops in exports to the US, as you'd expect. Okay, so that's trade destruction. In terms of trade diversion, this will depend on the extent to which there are differentials between countries, and the degree of substitutability between different foreign suppliers, and the supply capacity of alternative producers. So those are the kind of things that might affect the outcomes. And the diversion in the Trump 1.0, there's quite a lot of evidence and studies that have shown that Mexico was the main beneficiary of trade diversion of imports from China to Latin America. So the Mexican exports to the US increased as a result of the drop of Chinese exports. There doesn't seem to be much evidence of any trade diversion to other Latin American countries. And I haven't even seen any for the Dominican Republic and CAFTA, which you might expect might have benefited in the same way as Mexico. But that might be a lack of evidence rather than the fact that it didn't happen. On the other hand, the diversion of Chinese imports from the US to Latin America, we saw then, was predominantly as a result of agricultural products where the US and Latin America compete, especially soybeans and meat. And the main beneficiaries from that diversion in the first Trump administration were, of course, the Mercosur countries. Now, what's likely to happen?
Luis, you would have a few more minutes, okay?
Okay, right. So what am I going to say about diversion to US and from China to US imports from China to Latin America? And you can note that Latin American countries face lower effective tariffs than China, apart from Brazil, of course. And there was a very large drop in US imports from China after March of 2025. So, well, I just skip into this, which shows the change in US imports on the left-hand side from Latin America and China between July 2024 and July 2025. You see over 30% drop in imports from China and increases in imports from all three regions of Latin America, but much more from Mexico and Central America. On the other hand, Chinese imports, one can see that Chinese imports actually dropped. Chinese imports from Latin America and the US dropped during this period, the same period. Trade deflection, well, again, I don't think there's very much to say about that. There's some evidence of some deflection of Chinese exports to other markets, but this is limited to in terms of the number of products affected. And although there was some deflection to Mexico, it didn't seem to have affected other countries. And again, I think this under the present Trump administration, one could also say that trade deflection was going to be quite limited. The share of Chinese exports to Latin America actually fell in 2025. And it's more likely that that Chinese exports, which had been blocked from the US market, would be more likely to be exported to the EU than to Latin America. And similarly, doesn't expect very much deflection of US exports from China to Latin America. Lastly, the last aspect that I wanted to mention was rerouting, which involves the restructuring of global value chains. And that would have, if it occurred, would increase both the Latin American exports to the US and Latin American imports from China. Again, here, Mexico, together with Vietnam, and studies that have been done globally, were seen as countries that benefited considerably from rerouting of exports from China. But as I say, the main potential beneficiary from that was Mexico, and that seems to be the case now, although there's increased awareness and concerns in the US about the kind of loopholes that allowed China to re-export through other countries. And that might mean that the benefits would be, or the extent to which this occurs, will be much less than it was in the first Trump administration. And in any case, it's only likely to be significant in Mexico. And I could see no evidence of it having happened in 2025 so far. Okay, so just to conclude, and this is my last slide. I mean, firstly, it's very difficult to predict how US policies will affect Latin America because of the frequent changes of policy and because of the way in which the US administration is negotiating country-specific agreements. So, and also one needs to be aware of the history, geography, economic structures of specific Latin American countries and at the sub-regional level, which may lead to different outcomes. But having said how difficult it is, let me just try and say something. Although, as I said at the beginning, it's very early days yet to be able to see what's happening. So in Mexico, there are no clear trends in 2025 so far. And I think it's going to be very much dependent on the outcomes of the forthcoming USMCA negotiations. But I would predict that Mexico will remain closely tied to the United States, even as there might be some growth in Chinese involvement there. In the case of the Dominican Republic and Central America, there's been an increase in share of trade with China and the US. And in the case of the US, deals with El Salvador and Guatemala keep them close to the US, and there's a possibility that other countries, apart from probably Nicaragua, will get similar sorts of deals. But despite the fact that a number of these countries have recognized and established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic in recent years, they nevertheless have quite limited economic links, and they're not likely to see these economic relationships expand drastically. Whereas in South America, what you can see, there's an increase in share of trade with China in 2025, and a falling share of trade with the United States. So the differential, as it were, between US and Chinese involvement seems to be increasing. Trade links with the US, of course, has been weakened by protectionism, and South American countries have tended not to benefit from any diversion or deflection of trade. And the links with China, one can see as well during 2025, have continued to grow. So in a sense, what I'm saying here is that, if anything, all the current policies are doing is reinforcing the long-term trends, where South America is likely to see China as a more and more important trade partner, and the US becoming more marginal, whereas Central America and Mexico are likely to remain largely under the trade and economic influence of the United States. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rhys. We will ask all authors, hopefully you can send us your presentations so that everybody can have access to them. No, we will continue now with Evan Ellis, again at the Latin American Studies Institute and the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. Evan, are you around? I cannot see you.
I am. Can you hear me, Enrique?
You are.
I'm right here.
Yes,
Okay.
we can see and hear you. Thank you very much, Evan.
Thank you, Enrique. Well, first of all, it's a real pleasure for me to be part of this event, and thanks to everyone for their interest. I've put my presentation in the chat for those who are interested in downloading it. I would also emphasize that I am, of course, employed by the U.S. Army as a government civilian, but what I'm going to express here today are my frank opinions and not necessarily that of my employer or the U.S. government. Now, having said that, the focus of my comments today, I think you'll hear me speaking about a lot of themes that Rebecca and others, Rhys, have already discussed, but in a more geostrategic way, with references to the economic, but also trying to broaden it out. So with that, let me put up the presentation that I have to share.
Yeah.
So right now you should be able to see the presentation shared. I'm going to put it into full screen mode. Just to confirm,
yes.
Can you all see the presentation?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. I always put too much information in one briefing, so forgive me. I'm going to go a little bit quickly, but I wanted to start out with some overarching questions because I understood that this is really about the intersection between China's advance in Latin America and what's happening geopolitically with China. And so just to raise some issues, I think in Latin America, in the 25 years that I think Enrique and I and many others have covered this, there's long been a discourse about the opportunities presented by China, the risks presented by China's advance, the opportunities perhaps presented if the U.S. is now competing for favor. But I think sometimes it misses the point from a political strategic, which is how is that relationship evolving, and what are the broader non-economic impacts on the region. I think we've already seen a great discussion about the applicability of dependency theory. I love the previous term. Are we seeing a new neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics? I think whatever the answer, that question is certainly relevant to the discussion as Latin Americans think about how does Latin America realize not only the trade numbers, but also the value added in actually benefit from these dynamics. In addition, I think it's important to understand how China's activities are evolving, not only within the economic domain, but also increasingly some of the political content, the engagement at the multilateral level, at the subnational level, increasingly some of the political things through the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, this new Global Governments Initiative that was announced for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but clearly has applicability in Latin America and other things. And to me, I also see in some ways the Trump administration's increased attention on China's advance. Some of the threats, I think, have limited China's advances in some areas, but in other ways, I think it has actually accelerated China's advance, especially in the long term in the region. I think there's also a broader global question as we look at not only market share, but key areas like defense and artificial intelligence and rare earths, and the position of China versus the U.S. in existing institutions, political and otherwise. The question is the U.S. being outmaneuvered? Is it losing that strategic battle, to China's advance? And I'll leave that open for now, but I think kind of where things are going with respect to things not only like EVs that we've talked about, but artificial intelligence, et cetera. These are important questions to shape how this will play out in Latin America. And there's also the question of will current trends continue in a linear fashion, or will we see significant disruptions? Reese already talked about the results of some of the economic fights over tariffs, which are on again and off again, which have unpredictable impacts on global trade. We already saw how President Trump and Xi kind of backed off some of the tariff escalation. Will that happen again? And frankly, if in the coming years there is an attempt by the PRC to do away with the autonomy of Taiwan, will that escalate to a global military conflict that in terms of maritime logistics and in financial interactions could impact the dynamics in Latin America? Having said that, let me talk about some global trends that I see that I think are important to understanding Latin America, and then some Latin America trends. I think you'll see some of these we've already discussed in different other ways. So first of all, in my personal sense, I think that much of the scholarly discussion about the inherent demise of PRC, its economy, that somehow China is going to implode through its own internal contradictions, is probably overrated. I'm sure my colleagues have seen these discussions about the demographic dilemmas, massive youth unemployment, the healthcare crisis, problems with the educational system, pollution, et cetera, et cetera. For me, I think COVID and other things showed that although China may suffer significantly, the levers that the party has over its companies and the economy will allow party dominance to continue. And so, the trajectory will dramatically change. Number two, I think we continue to see this expanding trade, as my colleagues have shown, not only in Latin America, but globally. Things that Rebecca talked about in others, expanding global purchases of foodstuffs that China needs, increasing purchases of not only minerals, but especially strategic minerals, such as the rare earths and also lithium for the new energy economy. I think increasingly you see this accelerating trend that the sale of technologies companies, the way in which, as my colleagues have pointed out, electric vehicles are increasingly dominant from China globally. Even in European markets, they're making significant penetration, and the significant Chinese dominance of global service sectors, from digital, from telecommunications to cloud computing, especially with Huawei, but also with other companies such as Alibaba, certainly in the construction sector, and increasingly now in artificial intelligence. This is something that again, some of the people I've talked to on AI, there's something really interesting going on with China right now. They have invested in, for those of you who are computer tech geeks, and I am not, but China is pursuing basically an open source model. And so, in other words, that everything that it's doing in AI is shareable, which means that the tech people around the world who want to work in AI but not have to pay a lot of money for access to tools are increasingly drawn to some of the Chinese model and China progress, which to me is strategically important, that even if China is not at the leading edge in everything, China is positioning itself essentially to dominate the standards by the many other people who are gravitating to using Chinese AI tools, even if the West is ahead in certain areas. It is useful to point out globally as well as in other places, and I've done work also looking at China and Africa and Central America, that the difficulties that China has in terms of imposing very contract terms that often are very advantageous to it and disadvantageous to its partner, especially when those partners do not have good capabilities to evaluate the contract terms, or maybe when it's a government-to-government contract in the upstairs room of some Chinese restaurant after a lot of good wine, the contract that partners maybe don't care that much. We've often heard of the relatively low prices that partners receive for exports to China, especially for Latin America. The difficulties that Ecuador has had and also Honduras has had with the prices for shrimp, I think are relatively well known. Overall, and this goes back to Rebecca's point about the question of dependency in value added. What I think you do see, and one of my other colleagues mentioned the surprising vertical integration by Chinese companies. What I see over 25 years is the PRC globally their companies are making progress in capturing a lot of the value added in these critical industries. Beyond that, I think also going beyond Belt and Road, it's important to notice the way in which there's a strategic focus by the PRC in its global engagement on what I would call global connectivity. So ports, traditional transportation, but also increasingly electric transmission, generation, and distribution, especially in new energy sectors, and especially also increasingly in financial sectors, including even some movement into non-traditional financing. Beyond that, another factor I think is important to look at is how PRC decoupling from the United States. It's still incomplete. It started largely during the first Trump administration. I think it's accelerated now by the current situation, but it even continued during the Biden administration by the very hawkish orientation that people like Kirk Campbell in the Biden Asia expertise had for this. And so I think what's beginning to happen is that some of these successes that the PRC has had with that decoupling, you're seeing the PRC companies making significant advances in their own capability to generate their own rapid chips, some of their own indigenous technology. It's certainly been limiting, but I think you begin to see that in combination with significant PRC tech investment, especially in basic and applied research, that decoupling in some ways has created effects that have been very beneficial to the PRC's advance, independent of how the U.S. can limit or hurt it. In addition, of course, I've already talked about some of the possibilities of a renewed trade war if things in rare earths and agricultural purchases don't go the U.S. way. I think that could impact Latin America. It is also important to talk about political limits. My sinologist colleagues talk a lot about the question of the purges of 9 generals recently farthered in the fourth plenum of China's Communist Party. Some question of whether the replacement of the China Military Commission Vice Chair He Weidong, and essentially the revenge of the princelings, so to speak, how that could be interpreted. But it does appear that there are some questions, although she does not seem to be on the verge of being ousted anytime soon. But I think there are some questions about what are the true dynamics that are happening within China. I've already briefly spoken about global industries, but I think it is useful to understand globally that, in my judgment, the trend really is a increasing dominance of some of those important industries where the PRC is focused its energy. Again, as my colleagues have noted, especially electric vehicles in the new energy sector. And frankly, I think that has been accelerated by the policies of the Trump administration, effectively ceding terrain in research and even really admission of the effects of global warming. I think that has hurt the U.S. competitiveness globally in those areas. Certainly, digital, you see significant advances continuing by companies like Huawei, but also Xiaomi and others. The always existent problems that there has been limited Western competition. Even companies like Nokia and Ericsson really have been challenged to deploy technologies on top of existing Huawei 3G and 4G infrastructure. And the other thing I think that you're seeing as an indirect effect of what are seen as very kind of aggressive bullying, Trump administration policies, is that some of the previous Latin American incentives to stick with the U.S., even though the U.S. didn't have a better offer than Huawei, but to say, okay, the U.S. is democratic, the U.S., we want to ally ourselves with the U.S. wagon. So I think one of the indirect effects that there's not a lot of data for is the degree to which essentially that transactional focus of the Trump administration makes Latin American countries say, why are we doing this to ourselves? If the U.S. is going to be like this, why shouldn't we just go with Huawei, for example? And again, with respect to AI, I think I've already mentioned some of that. A few more global trends. Number one, again, as a person that focuses on security, one of the things that I recognize is the global advances in what I would call the PRC intelligence capability. This is not only for getting information that is relevant in a political military sense, but also in terms of commercial intelligence and commercial decisions that the PRC has long used to basically divert the intellectual property of others, including in the EV sector and clean energy sectors, to itself, as well as the defense sectors. I think in part it's getting access to that data, and in part it is getting access to information about the personal behavior of leaders around the world that can be used to bring pressure. And a part of this is the significant number of people that are brought over to China by people-to-people activities. I think all of us, on this call are aware of that. But what I've seen, at least in the part of it that kind of goes into the nefarious dimension, not just the wonderful foot massages and the Great Wall tourism and sliding down the slide and being wined and dined well, but it's those PRC intelligence collectors and the PRC party persons that try to maintain those relationships. My informal analysis, again, over about 25 years, is that the quality of that, research or capture and the coordination again between Chinese organizations focused on that has improved. In addition to that, I think, again, the U.S. has accelerated that problem because, as there is more disillusionment with President Trump, as some of our U.S. programs, like the Fulbright Scholarship Program, have been cut off, et cetera, that has, accelerated the success of those Chinese initiatives. And beyond intelligence or impact on discourse. Certainly, with Chinese military capability, it goes without saying. If you look at the Chinese Navy, which now exceeds the U.S., the quality of their submarines, the quality of their nuclear capability, as well as the quantity, significant advances by China in unmanned systems across the board, and some of the ways in which those are not only through the Ukraine war, but other things being made available to others. I think in a frightening fashion in terms of the affordability and quantity, China is far ahead of where the U.S. is with what I would call affordable systems. Chinese space progress also in terms of access to space systems, and of course the Mars missions and other things. Admittedly, there has been a cautiousness of the PRC in these advances with President Trump's pressure. But again, when I look at those tendencies, I think it shapes what is where things are going, including in Latin America. Also, briefly, PRC's global presence and sophistication of its companies. This has been mentioned before, the learning and the coordination between companies, vertical as well as horizontal integration. I think some of the Chinese attention to the fine print in contracts. Organization in William and Mary University called Aid Data did an excellent study called 100 Chinese Debt Contracts. For those who have not read this, about China's use of legal terms to gain advantage and make sure they get paid. I think it's a fascinating study that shows the global application of this. And frankly, while PRC companies are getting more sophisticated and having more global presence, we do see that with tariff policies, as I think Rice showed so well, the U.S. is ceding not only its appeal as a market for global goods, but it's also ceding the incentives for U.S. investors to go to other places in the world where, in order to import, they then have to jump back over those high tariff walls that the president has imposed. And then to talk about the PRC overall, the evolution of its global policies. Again, I'm recognizing that the PRC is becoming increasingly political in its orientation. If you look at the Global Governance Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, which includes engagement for Latin America, through CELAC and through the BRICS. In other words, through places that notably do not have the U.S. present in terms of the way that China wants to engage with Latin America on issues such as cooperation in counter narcotics, cooperation in data security, and things like that. I think the success, there's long been a discomfort towards the PRC in Latin America and elsewhere. What I worry about is the way in which the PRC's ability to successfully advance these secondary initiatives are accelerated by U.S. policy and perceived bullying and cutting off of programs like USAID, other State Department help programs, military threats, including even today against to essentially do military strikes against Colombia. That those things have that. If previously the U.S. had certain inherent advantages in the appeal of its democracy, the appeal of its soft power, etc., in many ways the U.S. it's not that China is winning that terrain. In many ways, it's that now that China is at least trying, the U.S. is withdrawing some of its own appeals. And certainly the U.S. has also undercut its ability to offer coordinated responses to China's advance. If you look at NATO and the Quad and AUKUS and individual relationships, etc. And in addition to that, the final global issue that I would say here is the question of, will the PRC act against Taiwan? Maybe not an invasion, maybe through a blockade that would, force a Taiwan government to end its autonomy. But I would say that globally, in terms of China's engagement, this would be strategically transformational, both in the Indo-Pacific with partners like Japan and Korea, but also across the Pacific for countries like Mexico and like Peru and like Chile, among others. others. So let me now turn, I went a little bit long, but in the 5 minutes I have remaining, to Latin America. So to reiterate a little bit, as my colleague has noted, certainly there are some benefits by China's engagement in Latin America. You see it, as Reese had mentioned, with the ability of Brazil and others in Mercosur to benefit from expanded agricultural exports, although it's largely been COFCO and other Chinese companies that have captured the value added. Very little, again, I think Becky's presentation did this very well. The question of, when it's mostly about primary products, again, increased in mining and petroleum exports. There's been an increase in Chinese investment, especially in lithium, and of course in Brazil in rare earths. But again, it's been the PRC companies capturing most of that value added in those extractive sectors. Clearly, there's also been Chinese investments in Latin American infrastructure modernization. So there is some benefit in getting cloud computing in 4 and 5G. There have clearly been implementation problems. Chinese companies are notoriously bad in doing the community consultations that you need to go forward with big highway projects, and that's caused problems again and again and again. And there's also questions of whether those contracts, which oftentimes have to be repaid, are the best possible use by those Latin American countries of that resource. The Chinese basically say, sign a contract that guarantees that we get paid and we'll build it. And certainly also technology modernization. Again, the question is, okay, if there's better telecom infrastructure, if there's better, smart cities, but if at the end of the day, if these are, controlled by Huawei or Didi or Hikvision or other, providers, both, does the benefit accrue to Latin America? To what degree? Are there data information risks, given that in 2017 that the Chinese national security policy obliges Chinese companies to turn over data that is relevant to the Chinese government? And also, we talked, I think, ironically, Enrique talked about the effect on developmental studies. I worry about that. I look at this. Enrique is the glass is half full. I'm perhaps the glass is half empty. But I worry about the lessons about China that if you just are willing to cede a little bit of democratic accountability and individual protections, we'll allow you to do a certain tech solution. So to what degree is both the Chinese tech solutions and also the examples of perceived Chinese successes undermining the traditional discourse that you need to have democracy and you need to have free markets for developments? Also in Latin America, I do worry about the degree to which the PRC is getting a lock-in some of those global industries. I worry about the degree to which there is a diminished ability for Latin America to fight against the kind of dependency tendencies, because there are many people who, in the interest of benefit for themselves, benefit for the companies, are afraid to criticize the track record of Chinese companies or the Chinese record globally, eliminating, say, crushing democracy in Hong Kong, militarization of islands in the South China Sea. I worry that the degree to which you have that distortion of the discourse, including many of the people who are Latin America's chief China experts, who themselves, oftentimes go to China on trips paid for by the Chinese government, etc., are reluctant to be critical to China because they've built relationships that they don't want to put in jeopardy. And so in many ways, those relationships of benefit or expected future benefit, I worry, inhibits Latin America's most knowledgeable China experts from being able to really think about how does Latin America most benefit from this. And then to conclude here, just a few more things. I think there are, as we've talked about, a question of impacts on erosion of Latin American democracy. We see that I think with countries like Venezuela. I mentioned the example of the PRC in Latin America discourse. And last, I just wanted to put out here the idea that if the PRC desire to put an end to the autonomy of Taiwan does result in a military conflict, it is to many of us who analyze this from a Southcom perspective, it is highly likely that the PRC would seek to do certain things to impair the ability of the U.S. to deploy and sustain forces to the Indo-Pacific, which would mean using capabilities that they have in terms of electronic observation facilities in Cuba, even commercial presence in the Caribbean, which is the lanes through which commercial ships have to, U.S. military ships have to pass. The question of the ability to shut down the Panama Canal, taking advantage of even commercial access and technical knowledge there. The possible exploitation of space facilities in Argentina, or the facilities they have built for Venezuela and in Bolivia to be able to locate U.S. satellites and help them fight that space fight. And frankly, even things like the possible ability, either because the Peruvian government doesn't have sufficient control, or because a future government is incapacitated to be able to say no, the opportunities that the PRC has through those port operations to be able to militarily exploit those in ways that would allow the resupplying of their warships with ammunition, and that essentially would turn the Eastern Pacific into a possible future zone of conflict, or even the possible use, as was the concern in 2024, of migration corridors going through Mexico. Clearly not all military-aged Chinese males that snuck into the United States in 2024 were People's Liberation Army, but I think there are some concerns within the U.S. that it would be unthinkable that the MSS in China and others did not at least try to take advantage of those corridors to try to locate at least some people there that could be used in the future in time of conflict. So forgive this very rapid presentation. That's my story, and I welcome the opportunity for questions and feedback. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Evan. And well, we have a good time, half an hour, to allow for at least for a good round, maybe 2 rounds of responses by the presentations. No, I think all of you have the possibility of look at. There are some detailed questions for all 3 presentations, and I would simply highlight a couple of topics to begin this discussion. No, it would be interesting to know your opinion regarding these institutional weaknesses on China in Latin America and the Caribbean, no, that we started discussing in the first session. I believe it might be interesting to hear your opinion. A second topic would be the issue of the public sector in China again. No, how important is this in your opinion? No, you could regard it as an important opportunity. No, when you look at the CELAC China Forum, it's a huge portfolio with hundreds of options. No, including technology of transfer and hundreds of topics regarding sports, but also national security issues, trade, investment, you name it, hundreds of topics. No, how important is this in your opinion? Very specifically, for example, regarding electric vehicles, electric batteries, Jorge, how important is the public sector? And I would say beyond the fashion in Latin America of saying, yes, we need an industrial policy. No, if 40% of your GDP is the property of the public sector, this goes far beyond industrial policy. You're speaking of educational policy, technological policy, transportation, and industrial policy. But the industrial policy discussion of Latin America from this perspective is pretty secondary, I humbly believe. No, 2 other issues regarding the presentation of Rhys Jenkins, very interesting, I believe. Here, Rhys, I would include an additional topic regarding this import substitution policies tariff discussion. No, one the discussion of, yes, Latin America and the Caribbean, Mexico might be favored if you want to by lower tariffs. But I remind you, based on the empirical discussion that is going on in Latin America, in 2024, Mexico paid a 0.25% tariff for US exports to the United States. If you start discussing tariffs around 15, 20%, etc., yes, firms established in Mexico, in many cases US firms, might be benefited in relative terms. But at the micro level, when you discuss specific firms that will start paying tariffs 100 times, 150 times higher than in 2024, the risks and challenges are enormous. Yes, you might say, you know what, you are better off than the competition. But in 2025, you will have to start paying billions and billions of dollars. No? At the micro and firm level, this is substantial, no? And this has been discussed. Finally, Evan, very interesting, lots of topics to be discussed, including these dominating standards, no, that are appearing, and probably, Evan, particularly for infrastructure projects. No, I'm always very surprised that in Washington many people discuss these lots of issues regarding what is going on in the backyard of the United States regarding trade and investments, etc. I believe the most sophisticated from a technological perspective, but also in terms of financing of standards and whatever, are infrastructure projects. No, this will have long-lasting impacts, 50 years. If you have a hydroelectric power plant, no, the on and off button will be in Chinese, not to speak of plenty of other topics. But this is not being discussed in detail today, neither in Washington nor in other topics. But again, some issues that might be of interest for some discussions in addition to the questions. So I would suggest to respond in the same way as you presented, and depending of your time, we might have time for a second round. No? So Jorge, if you might begin.
Well, thank you, Enrique. First of all, when you talk about the institutional weakness, I think we cannot compare Mexico with, for instance, with China, because we are exactly in the opposite side. You're one of the experts on China. But it's so clear that talking about the automotive sector, and when I say automotive, it's not just producing cars, it's the whole ecosystems with all digitalization, AI, infrastructure, and etc. And the public sector is so important. It's so clear the relevance, and it's good. This is is the Asian model. I mean, this happened in Japan before, and later in other countries such as Korea, and nowadays in China. So it's not, of course, it's in a different shape, right? Because it's a socialist market or whatever you want to call. But anyway, the presence of the state is so active, so important in those areas, and as we know, the success of this model has been clear. In many indicators. So industrial policy. Well, Mexico always try to repeat and to talk. Now we have a real roadmap, etc., etc. But in terms of the backward linkages, is is not good. It's not good at all. It's maybe 3%, depends on which sector you are talking about. Of course, it's different in the auto sector because it's even though it's a global sector, it's a regional trade. It's clear that it's different than other commodities industries. But the electrification roadmap that is was announced a few weeks ago by the president, I mean, my point in my view is not enough. I mean, you need a lot of resources in order to change this pattern, and it's more now is more complicated because there are some challenges. For instance, the labor cost, and he's not just talking about wages, is really increasing in Mexico. So of course there are different factors, but this is one of important factor. And we have the example of Chihuahua, where companies are leaving, companies in the first, second generation, but also companies in the R&D, focus on R&D activities are leaving. So, I mean, it's a challenge, this issue. So the second is the pressure that do not allow champions to arrive, such as BYD, for instance. I mean, why we want Toyota and Volkswagen and Tesla, but no BYD. So it makes no sense. I mean, in terms of the historical point of view. Uh, and last one, but not least but not last, is the negotiations in the UNSCA 2.0, because will be very, very hard in terms of labor. I mean, unions and another segments are really pressure in order to elevate the the standards, the wages, and is, I mean, we are in another type of economy than US, so it's gonna be very, very hard. So the challenge are more complicated nowadays in order to just to follow a industrial policy in Mexico for improving and upscaling the automotive industry. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Reese, do you have some responses to the presentations, your questions, the issues
Right.
raised?
Well, I'm very interested with Jorge's paper in that I first worked in Latin America in my PhD in the 1970s, which was on the auto industry in Latin America, including Mexico. And it's interesting to see where things have gone. In terms of your specific question, Enrique, about, yes, the relevance of the level of tariffs that Mexico or other Latin American countries face compared to that it's the absolute level that's important, not so much the relative level. And what I wanted to say about that is that, the absolute level is what affects what I refer to as trade destruction, and it's the relative level that affects trade diversion. So the fact that, Mexico faces a lower tariff than China could benefit it in terms of trade diversion. So the question then is, how much trade destruction does Mexico suffer from, and how much trade diversion does it benefit from? And of course, that will depend, and that's what I was trying to say in the Mexican case, it would depend on the outcome of the negotiations. And that seems to me that, there are interests, as you said. It's not just that it's Mexican exporters, it's actually these are part of integrated global value chains or North American value chains where US companies play a significant role. So it's not really in the interests of those companies to have very high levels of tariffs on Mexican imports. So my expectation would be that Mexico would be able to negotiate relatively good access to the US market rather than, so that in that circumstances, the trade diversion effect becomes more significant than the trade destruction. In terms of the other questions that you raised, I mean, I think that's the whole question of ownership. I do wonder about, you put a great deal of emphasis on the formal ownership and the fact that these are part of the public sector. Presumably the implication of that and the questions for development, thinking about development, is that because of that, they will behave in a different way from privately owned companies. And I mean, I think there's quite a bit of evidence that, even state companies, even publicly owned companies, actually do pursue their own particular managerial interests and not just that they're not. I mean, I think the danger of it is that by emphasizing ownership so much, you then feed into the view of these companies as just being tools of China's grand strategy to dominate the world. I don't think this is necessarily the view that you take yourself, but I think we need to get a bit more into, well, what actual difference does ownership make in these circumstances? And is the most obvious difference would be the one that they're subject to more state influence. But if that's not what you're saying, then what is the key thing about ownership that's relevant here? And the question about institutions, I mean, it's a very thorny questions. But one comment that I wanted to make in relation to institutions and the frequent references to the China-CELAC forum is, it still seems to me that China's relations, the way that China manages relations with Latin America is largely bilateral still, despite all the hoo-ha and talk about these large meetings every couple of years, the forum, that in practical terms, China's not that interested in developing or having Latin America relate to China as a collective. It's a divide and rule strategy in a sense, as far as China's the Chinese leadership is concerned. It's not one that emphasizes integration and a common front on the part of the Latin American countries. And so I think that, I don't want to put it too strongly, but the forum, the CELAC China relationship is a bit of theatre. And I know there are sort of announcements made and there are things that, funds set up. But in the end, I mean, it's actually the bilateral relationship that determines, the construction projects and the investment projects that actually take place. So I'm a bit skeptical about that side of things. Okay, that's my comments for now.
So for me, thank you, Rhys. Please, Eva.
Thank you. And lots of great questions. So with respect to institutional weaknesses, I have a slightly different take, but for me, the institutional weaknesses in Latin America not only make it difficult for Latin America to collectively bargain a position to get the most out of planning to retain value added, but also allow the Chinese often to get advantages in contracts, which leads to conflicts with the United States. And as I mentioned before, there is a dimension in terms of the ability to have oversight of the details of contracts, questions of transparency that undermine issues of particular benefits, issues of the ability to effectively evaluate competing bids, and frankly, enforcement on the back end of some of the things that are agreed to. But also important to recognize that Latin American countries are heterogeneous. Some countries like Chile and Uruguay are higher on the institutional scale, perhaps than others. With respect to public sector, I agree with Enrique that this is a very important object of study. For me, I think it is inherently problematic when we say what really is the public sector in China. Are we talking about differences between nationally oriented SOEs versus more local state oriented? For example, Cherry more focused in Anhui, although it's become more of a global or Chinese company, and or other companies like Sany Heavy Industries or Alibaba, which appear to be private, but there are ways in which the Chinese state can use them as tools. Even Huawei arguably falls into that category. To me, also, the interesting thing about public sector is that I think the success of China sends certain lessons to Latin America about the viability of development through a substantial public sector role in an industrial policy. And so I think I agree with Enrique that is impacting the debate about development in Latin America. With respect to tariffs, I think there are concerning impacts of U.S. tariff policies. I think number one, you have an impact on U.S. investment in places where we want to compete against China. Again, if we're trying to say that the U.S. private sector should invest in country X as an alternative to China, but to invest in Latin American country, they have to jump back over the tariff wall. Our tariff policies and our competing with China through the public sector policy are inherently contradicting each other. Also, I think when you see the U.S. tariffs, especially on countries like Brazil, it decreases U.S. leverage while pushing those countries farther into dependence on China. If you look at Brazil, for example, shutting Brazil out of the U.S. coffee market, while at the same time Brazil expanded not only its coffee exports, but its dependency on the exports of soybeans to China. So in many ways, those tariffs are accelerating China's leverage and China dependence. With respect to infrastructure projects, to me, there are questions of different types of infrastructure. I think there are less vulnerabilities of transportation infrastructure than, for example, digital infrastructure. There's the question of, are these things, if the Chinese just build a road and leave it there, I think the impact is minimal. It just impacts the position of a company like China Harbor in the local economy and sector. But if it's a matter of controlling that infrastructure, I think, and especially if it's controlling digital or electricity infrastructure, that I think raises additional risks. But in addition to that, I think the U.S. has shown an interest in pushing back, especially in digital, although I think that is very uneven. And then finally, just a few good questions that were raised in the chat. The question about the role of Europe, I think is interesting. I do see Europe as becoming, recognizing the China threat much more, but because of the dependence of European companies on the China market and the Chinese partial ownership of many European countries, and some of the vulnerabilities Europe has with essentially the change in direction by the U.S. administration, I think Europe has become more threatened yet more vulnerable to China at the same time. I think India, the same question from the same person. On the one hand, the ability to cooperate with India as we once did through the Quad or in Latin America has been undercut by U.S. hostility toward India because of its alignment with Russia. But on the other hand, India itself has become more threatened by China. If we look at only, I think it was Uttar Pradesh, but the recent Chinese ramping up of territorial claims against India. There was a good question, what can the U.S. do? And just very briefly, to me, it has to do with, frankly, everything that we're walking away from doing now. An increased focus on transparency, an increased focus on supporting building strong Latin American institutions, leveraging the appeal of U.S. democracy, as part of our soft power, putting more data out there through organizations we used to have like USAID or U.S. State Department, communication programs. Working more with partners like the Koreans and the Japanese, where we don't have the solution. Unfortunately, we're walking away from that. And of course, working more with private sector alternatives to Chinese investments. But again, that runs into the problem with the tariff walls. So I'll stop with that. I left my email in the chat for those who did not have the chance to have me address your questions. Please do feel free to reach out. I welcome the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evan. We might have a little time for a last round of some opinions and responses, lots of different questions, no? A topic that is arising in Latin America, also in Central America and Mexico, is what happens if you have an increasing pressure of substituting imports from China through tariffs for example, in Mexico, but if China is the technological leader. That is a problem, no? Because then you cannot import tires or electric batteries from the Vatican because the Vatican does not produce them, no? But neither does the US. A not irrelevant discussion, why weren't tariffs raised against China very recently, no? This changes the discussion on import substitution, no? The issue of the public sector and property, no, as Reese highlighted, part of a grand strategy. It might be, it might not be, but very clearly, property matters, no? If some of the Latin American and Caribbean countries start discussing or having a strong opinion on the issue of one China, I can assure you this will matter, no? As it is happening continuously now in Costa Rica or Honduras and other countries where high-level politicians discuss the topic. I can assure you that this matters, no? So you can have a very managerial firm, public firm, but property, I can assure you, is not irrelevant, no? And finally, I would invite you to integrate to the institutional discussion. Yes, in Latin America, we have lots of weaknesses regarding the knowledge of China and specific value chains. The same happens in China. No? When you go to China and you say, well, how many experts do we have in China on Brazil? If you get 5, it's too much. On Mexico, 3. And how many do you have on Costa Rica or Guatemala or whatever? 0. No? So it's important to have a clear picture of limits on both sides of the Pacific, no? And not to fall into a trap of saying, you know what, in China everything is working fantastically well, and in Latin America, forget it. This is not realistic, no? But well, I don't know, Jorge, Reese, Evan, if you want to say something very briefly, 1 or 2 minutes before we end the seminar, no? And yes, please.
Well, just in a very briefly way, my feeling, I mean, my opinion, based on the institutional setting in both sides, Mexico and China, what has been seen and what we've seen in both countries is, there are many stakeholders in Mexico, but it's not only one voice. There are many. It's very heterogeneous. And different stories. They can tell you. Okay, and I mean, of course, China is so big, but I mean, just getting from the OEMs companies and from the municipal policymakers and so on, mix public-private, one voice in China, one voice. They're clear what they want, and everything goes exactly in that way. So that makes a huge difference then for policies. I will stop here, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Jorge. Reese, would you like to say something?
I think that, I mean, the last thought that I have is that, we live in such turbulent times. Everything is in such a state of flux and so much uncertainty, and it will, we wake up tomorrow morning or next Monday, and things will be totally different, at least because of what's happening in the United States, in Russia, in the Middle East. And it's very difficult to make predictions about which way anything is going to go. But I think it's been a stimulating seminar. And I'd just like to thank you all for inviting me to take part in it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ruiz. Evan, one last brief reflection, if you wish.
Thank you, Enrique. And again, thank you to you and to the organizers for the opportunity to be part of this. It's been a real pleasure and a real honor. Just a few quick thoughts. Number one, I come back to something that is overarching for me, the way in which current changes in U.S. policy is really accelerating the effectiveness of China's advance in Latin America, and that for me, in many ways, the limitations have primarily been about the mistrust and the inability of China to fully take advantage of that opportunity. I would also mention the extraordinary opportunity with respect to Honduras and the prospect that the new government has already committed to recognizing Taiwan. That would be the first such reverse of a major power since Nicaragua in 1990. And so that's on my radar screen. When I look at Mexico with the USMCA or TICAN negotiations, to me, Mexico's orientation with the U.S., the question is what happens if or after USMCA negotiations fail? I hope they don't. I don't think it's probable, but I think that could affect Mexico's trajectory vis-a-vis the U.S. and China. And then a broader financial issue that we haven't talked about is the U.S. dollar. China is actively working through BRICS, was actively working through bilateral currency swap agreements, many things to decenter the U.S. dollar. It is decreasing its purchases and work with U.S. dollars on its own. A world in which the U.S. dollar does not have its hegemony as a currency, in which China has an increased role, will be a dramatically different financial system with Chinese leverage than the one that we're used to dealing with in the past 30 or 40 years of China's rise. So again, thanks for this wonderfully stimulating discussion. And again, thanks for the opportunity to be part of it.
Thank you, Evan. Firat, would you like to say some final words before we finish?
Oh, no, thank you, everybody, for fantastic two panels. I think we learned a lot. We'll make the videos available to all the, publicly available. And thank you for the participants. I just posted the websites for the three organizations that have co-sponsored it. And I'd like to bring two questions, perhaps, for the wider public and also for our participants. It's related to some of the questions posted. And then I know for the respect for people's time, we are over time already by one minute. One is the difference between power and influence. At the security in context, we have been working on several research tracks to differentiate the two. And when we talk about China and Chinese influence, we, I think, conflate the two regarding Chinese power in Latin America and the global South and the rest of the world, and influence. To measure that, we did one attempt to look at international organization leadership. So we made the data publicly available. We looked at the 300 plus international organizations, intergovernmental, NGO, private, and so on, and looked at the leadership structures. China or the rest of the global South has pretty much no presence in the leadership positions of international organizations. If you want to predict with over 30% probability of the leaders of any international organization of any type, you need to be a white male from Harvard University. That's amazing in terms of the persistence and path dependency of Northern, especially North American presence in leadership positions. The second one is related to, and I will bring the question to Evan to think about going forward in terms of future collaboration, perhaps too, is the defense industries. We just completed a database on international arms trade and dual-use goods trade. Unlike what most people think, U.S. is not number one exporter of global arms or dual-use goods anymore. It is China. China is the world's largest dual-use goods exporter by far. And it doesn't matter how you break it down, from small arms to dual use of any types. And it includes also security and surveillance technologies and how it reshapes both existing institutional fault lines in the global South, how it empowers authoritarian regimes or democracies and so on, and the ways in which it influences policymaking in the global south. Increasing presence of, for example, drones from the global south countries, including China, be that Turkish drones in Ukraine, be that Chinese surveillance technologies or dual-use goods in other parts of the world. So I think there's a lot that can be explored in terms of both costs and benefits, and the ways in which it reshapes policymaking and institutional infrastructure in Latin America and the Caribbean and beyond. But other than that, I'd like to thank you all. Thank you, Enrique, and the rest of the panelists. I personally learned a lot and like to continue having this conversation in future panels.
Thank you, Firat. As it happens, we end with, I hope not more questions than initially, but we end up with lots of questions. And welcome to a very dynamic learning process. We will upload the videos and the PowerPoints. Please, Riz and Evan, Celio, if you allow us. Celio just sent it, but if you send us your PowerPoints, we attempt to do a very open, transparent process of learning. And so please send them to us, and we will publish in some format. We will get back to the presentations as soon as possible. And so thank you very much for your time, for your patience. And as you witnessed, this discussion will not end today. We have set up a floor that will go on for some time in the future. Thank you, Firat, and thank you, everybody. Celio, Evan, Becky, Yolanda, Jorge, Riz, thanks for your support. So see you soon. Thank you.
Ciao, everyone.
Ciao.